The house that kept its silence. There are certain streets in certain villages that seem to have made an agreement with time. They remain much as they were 20 years before, and are expected to remain the same for 20 years after. The hedges are clipped on Thursdays, the brass knockers are polished on Fridays, curtains are drawn at the same hour each evening, and the inhabitants go about their lives with a regularity that gives great comfort to those who like to believe the world is, at heart, orderly. Elm Street in the village of Elmbridge was one of those streets. It was a narrow, respectable row of semi-detached houses with red brick fronts and white painted gates, each house trying very hard not to outshine the next. There were flower boxes under the front windows, polished letter plates, and front gardens so carefully tended that even the roses seemed to bloom in a disciplined way. In autumn, the trees that gave the street its name dropped yellow leaves with graceful reluctance, and the pavements wore them like a faded carpet. Nothing improper was supposed to happen on Elm Street. That was why the disappearance of Miss Eleanor Firth caused such a disturbance. Not noisy, dramatic disturbance, for Elmbridge was not a noisy village, but the sort of disturbance that passed quietly from one drawing room to another, arriving in lowered voices and lingering in the air long after the speaker had gone. Miss Eleanor Firth lived alone at number 8. She was 62 years of age, of medium height, with neatly waved grey hair and a face that might once have been plain had her intelligence not sharpened it into distinction. She dressed carefully, though never fashionably, and possessed that particular form of restraint which made one feel she had been taught young that emotions were private matters. Her habits were exact. She took her morning walk at 8:30, carried a black market basket on Wednesdays, posted letters every Friday afternoon, and attended church with a devotion that was neither showy nor warm, but consistent. She had lived on Elm Street for nearly 17 years. If anyone had asked the neighbours whether they knew Miss Firth well, they would probably have said yes. If pressed further, it would have emerged that they knew only that she was punctual, courteous, and never gave cause for complaint. She was the sort of woman about whom little was said because little was thought to exist. Yet it is often those people, quiet, self-contained, almost invisible, whose absence creates the strangest void. It was Mrs. Gladys Peabody from number 6 who first noticed that something was wrong. Mrs. Peabody was a widow with an alert nose, a narrower mouth, and a sincere belief that vigilance was a civic duty. She claimed, with some justice, that if everyone took as much interest in their street as she did, England would be a better governed country. She was in the habit of opening her front curtains at precisely 20 minutes to 9 each morning, partly for light, and partly, as she would have said, to see that everything was in order. On that particular Tuesday morning she parted the curtains, peered out at the soft grey light and the leaves blowing over the stones, and immediately felt the first prick of uneasiness. Miss Firth's milk bottle was still standing untouched on the step. That in itself was unusual. By 8:30 it was always brought in, by 9 certainly. Mrs. Peabody stood for some seconds with the curtain in hand. Then she noticed something else. The front sitting room curtains at number 8 were only half drawn. Miss Firth never left them so. By 9:10, after a struggle between propriety and curiosity in which curiosity won by a very decent margin, Mrs. Peabody crossed the path and knocked at the door. There was no answer. She knocked again, louder. Still nothing. She tried the handle. The door was unlocked. Mrs. Peabody would later say that she opened it only because she feared illness. That was true enough, though it did not exclude the possibility that she was also eager to know what she would find. The little front hall was neat as a pin, umbrella stand in place, mat square, a faint smell of lavender and polish. She called out sharply, "Miss Firth?" Her voice went up the stairs and came back to her. No answer. She moved into the sitting room and stopped. At first glance it looked absurdly normal. A small coal fire had burned low in the grate. On the side table sat a teapot beneath its knitted cover, 1 cup and saucer beside it, and a plate with 2 untouched biscuits. On the escritoire near the window lay a sheet of writing paper and a fountain pen. A letter had been begun. "My dear Agnes, I have been thinking for some time that what happened in October cannot be allowed to remain." There the sentence broke off. Mrs. Peabody stared at it. She was not by nature imaginative, but the unfinished line gave her a disagreeable sensation between the shoulders. She called again, louder this time, and then, with growing agitation, searched the rest of the house. The bed had been slept in. A navy cardigan lay folded across the chair in the bedroom. In the kitchen, the kettle was still faintly warm. At the back door, the key was in its place. In the garden, a narrow path ran between damp borders to a gate that stood, not open exactly, but not fully latched either. Mrs. Peabody went no further. She hurried out, nearly colliding with Mr. Leonard Briggs from number 10, who had come over after seeing her enter the house. Mr. Briggs was a retired bank clerk with a long neck, cautious eyes, and a habit of saying "dear me" when startled. "Well?" he asked. "She isn't there," said Mrs. Peabody breathlessly. "Nowhere. The house is all open, and there's a letter." "A letter?" "Half written, about something that happened in October." Mr. Briggs blinked. "What happened in October?" "How should I know?" snapped Mrs. Peabody. "I haven't read the village archives." By 11 o'clock the news had reached nearly everyone on Elm Street. By noon it had reached the grocer, the postmistress, the doctor's wife, and the vicar's sister. By 1, Inspector Hale from Much Benham had arrived with a constable, and an expression suggesting he had been deprived of his lunch. Inspector Hale was a broad man in his 40s with brisk manners and a face reddened by either weather or impatience. He listened to Mrs. Peabody's account, made notes, examined the house, and concluded, at least publicly, that there was no immediate sign of violence. "No struggle," he said. "No indication of forced entry. No blood, no broken furnishings, no signs of theft. It is entirely possible Miss Firth went out early." "In her bedroom slippers?" said Mrs. Peabody. Hale looked at her. "Were her shoes all accounted for?" That caused some confusion. Presently it was discovered that one practical pair of outdoor shoes was missing, along with Miss Firth's dark coat. This gave the inspector a mild air of satisfaction. "There we are, then." "But the tea," said Mr. Briggs. "It was poured." Perhaps she was interrupted. "And the letter?" Mrs. Peabody pressed. "People break off letters every day of the week." He said it reasonably, but there was a stiffness in him. He did not like streets full of watchers. And Elm Street had developed a remarkable number of them. Faces appeared at windows and withdrew. Garden gates clicked. Voices dropped as he passed. Respectability had become intensely observant. By late afternoon, the village had formed 3 opinions. The first was that Miss Firth had gone to visit someone suddenly, and would return embarrassed by all the fuss. The second was that she had suffered some kind of nervous collapse and wandered away. The third, expressed softly and with relish, was that there must be some hidden scandal in her life after all. Only one person on Elm Street said very little. Mrs. Clara Whitcomb of number 11, who lived opposite Miss Firth, was a thin, upright woman with silver hair and a face like folded paper. She saw everything from her front window, and commented on almost nothing when Mrs. Peabody carried the news to her in a state of contained triumph. Mrs. Whitcomb listened, looked across the street at number 8, and merely said, "People disappear long before they are missed." It was the sort of remark that ought to have produced an effect. In Mrs. Peabody it produced irritation. "Oh really, Clara? One needn't talk in riddles." Mrs. Whitcomb gave a faint smile. "Needn't one?" That same evening, as twilight thinned over Elmbridge and lamps came on behind curtained windows, a train from London drew into the small station. Among the passengers was an elderly lady in a soft tweed coat and an old-fashioned hat trimmed with violets. She carried a modest suitcase and a handbag, and looked, to the hurried eye, exactly like dozens of other harmless elderly ladies travelling alone in England. But Miss Jane Marple's pale blue eyes were not harmless. They were attentive. She had come to Elmbridge at the invitation of an old acquaintance, Miss Lydia Harmon, who had lately taken a house near the end of Elm Street and written rather plaintively of rheumatism, village dullness, and a maid who overboiled cabbage. As Miss Marple stepped down onto the platform, she noticed at once the curious little hum in the air, not excitement precisely, but the residue of it. A porter was speaking to the station master in a lowered voice. 2 women near the exit were discussing somebody's front door being found open. A name drifted across. Miss Firth. Miss Marple did not stare. She never stared. She merely adjusted her glove, took up her suitcase, and moved toward the station gate with that gentle, unobtrusive air which often led people to speak freely in front of her. By the time she reached Lydia Harmon's house half an hour later, the story had already begun arranging itself in her mind, not as fact, but as pattern. A woman vanishes, the house is tidy, the tea is poured, a letter stops in the middle of a sentence. It was, Miss Marple thought, as she was kissed on the cheek by the fluttering Miss Harmon and led inside, either a very ordinary matter indeed, or something done with great care. The next morning in Elmbridge began as all proper mornings ought, with a pale sky, a faint chill, and the quiet rustle of routines reassembling themselves after the disturbance of the previous day. Yet something had shifted. It was not visible in any single thing, but rather in the way people moved. Doors were opened more quickly than usual. Curtains parted with a touch of urgency. Conversations, when they occurred, began at once without the usual polite circling. Miss Lydia Harmon, who had insisted on making breakfast herself, despite her complaints of rheumatism, placed a plate of toast before Miss Marple and said, in a tone trembling between excitement and disapproval, "My dear Jane, you have arrived at the most extraordinary moment. A disappearance, right here on Elm Street. Such a thing has not happened in years." Miss Marple spread her marmalade thoughtfully. "So I gathered," she said mildly. "Miss Firth, was it not?" "Yes. Eleanor Firth. Quiet woman. Kept very much to herself. Quite dependable, I always thought. And then, gone, without so much as a word." Miss Harmon leaned forward. "They say the kettle was still warm." "How very odd," said Miss Marple, in a voice that suggested she found it exactly as odd as it ought to be. "And a letter left unfinished," Miss Harmon added. "Something about October. Mrs. Peabody told me everything, of course. She was the one who found the house." "Indeed?" Miss Marple did not ask further questions at once. She took her tea, which was properly brewed. Miss Harmon, for all her faults, knew how to make tea, and allowed the silence to stretch just long enough for Miss Harmon to fill it. "They're saying it might be one of those spells," Miss Harmon went on. "You know how it is. People live alone and suddenly something comes over them." Said Miss Marple. "And yet," Miss Harmon lowered her voice, "Mrs. Peabody says the teacup was wrong." Miss Marple looked up. "Wrong? Yes. Apparently Miss Firth always used a blue-patterned cup in the mornings. A little habit of hers, but yesterday the cup on the tray was plain white." Miss Marple set down her spoon very carefully. "Ah," she said. Miss Harmon blinked. "You don't think that signifies anything, do you?" "My dear Lydia," said Miss Marple gently, "it is often the smallest habits that tell us the most. People are remarkably consistent in the little things. When they are not, one begins to wonder why." After breakfast, Miss Marple expressed a desire for a short walk. Miss Harmon, who was not inclined to exertion, provided directions and instructions in equal measure. "You must see Elm Street," she said. "It's just around the corner. You'll know it at once. So neat. And number 8 is halfway down on the right. Though I don't suppose they'll let you in." Miss Marple smiled. "One never knows," she said. Elm Street looked exactly as it had been described. Orderly, composed, and faintly self-satisfied. The hedges were clipped, the windows shone. Even the fallen leaves seemed to have arranged themselves in an agreeable fashion, but there was no mistaking the subtle tension beneath it. A woman at number 4 paused in sweeping her step to glance up the road. A man at number 10 lingered longer than necessary over his gate latch. At number 6, Mrs. Peabody stood in her doorway like a sentinel. Miss Marple approached her with a pleasant expression. "Good morning," she said. "I wonder if you might direct me to number 8. I am staying with Miss Harmon and heard something of the unfortunate circumstances." Mrs. Peabody's eyes sharpened at once. Here was an audience. "Indeed, madam," she said, "a most distressing affair. I was the one who found the house, you know." "So I have heard." Mrs. Peabody stepped aside at once, eager to conduct the narrative. "It's just there," she said, pointing, "though I must say the police have already been through everything. Not that they seem to have done much. Inspector Hale is a very practical man." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Practicality can be useful." "Yes, well," said Mrs. Peabody, "it can also lead one to overlook things." Miss Marple gave a small, understanding smile. "And what, in your opinion, has been overlooked?" Mrs. Peabody drew herself up slightly. "The teacup," she said. "Ah, yes. I mentioned it to the inspector, of course, but he seemed to think it of no importance. Imagine! Miss Firth used the same cup every morning for years, blue with a little crack along the rim. She told me once it had belonged to her mother, and yet yesterday there it was, plain white. From the back of the cupboard, I should think. Why would she do that?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. She was looking across the street. At number 8, the curtains were now fully drawn, the door closed, the house composed once more into silence. But it was a different kind of silence. Not the quiet of routine, but the quiet of interruption. "May I?" Miss Marple said, indicating the path. Mrs. Peabody hesitated only a fraction of a second. "Well, I suppose it can do no harm. They've taken away anything important, I imagine." Inside, the house still bore the faint echo of the previous day's disturbance. It had been tidied, too tidied perhaps, but the arrangement of things retained a certain stiffness, as though order had been imposed rather than restored. Miss Marple moved slowly, her eyes taking in everything without appearing to linger on anything. The sitting room was exactly as described. The teapot remained on the table, though now uncovered. The white cup and saucer stood beside it. The plate of biscuits had been removed. On the escritoire, the unfinished letter lay where Mrs. Peabody had found it. Miss Marple approached it. "My dear Agnes, I have been thinking for some time that what happened in October cannot be allowed to remain." She read it twice, then once more, as though listening for something between the words. "Do you know this, Agnes?" she asked. Mrs. Peabody shook her head. "No one local, as far as I'm aware." Though Miss Firth was not a great one for discussing her affairs. "No." Miss Marple turned back to the tea tray. She lifted the cup gently, examining it. Plain white. No chip. No stain. Quite ordinary. She replaced it and opened the cupboard beside the hearth. Inside were several cups. Among them, unmistakable even at a glance, was a blue-patterned one with a fine crack along the rim. Miss Marple closed the cupboard. "Curious," she murmured. "What is?" asked Mrs. Peabody eagerly. "Only that people do not generally change their habits without a reason, and when they do, the reason is seldom random." Mrs. Peabody nodded vigorously. "Exactly what I said." Miss Marple moved toward the window. Outside, the small front garden lay undisturbed. Beyond it, the street stretched in quiet alignment. Directly opposite, at number 11, a figure stood at the window, Mrs. Clara Whitcomb. She did not move as Miss Marple looked at her. She merely watched. There was nothing overtly unfriendly in her expression, and yet there was something reserved. Not the polite reserve of the village, but a more deliberate kind. As though she were holding something back. Not information necessarily, but judgment. Miss Marple gave a small, courteous nod. Mrs. Whitcomb did not return it. "Ah," said Mrs. Peabody, following Miss Marple's gaze. "Mrs. Whitcomb. Keeps herself to herself, that one. Sees everything, though. Nothing escapes her. So I imagine." Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, then turned away. "I think," she said gently, "that I should very much like to speak with her." Mrs. Peabody looked faintly disappointed. She had more to say, clearly, but Miss Marple's tone left little room for objection. "Well, of course," she said, "though I cannot promise she will be forthcoming." Miss Marple smiled. "People rarely are," she said. "At first." They crossed the street together, the gravel crunching softly beneath their feet. Mrs. Whitcomb opened the door before they knocked. "I saw you coming," she said. Her voice was low and even, with a faint dryness to it. Up close, her face seemed even more delicate, lines drawn finely, like pencil marks that had not quite been erased. "This is Miss Marple," said Miss Marple gently. "I am staying with Miss Harmon." Mrs. Whitcomb inclined her head. "Yes, I thought you might be." She stepped aside. The house at number 11 was dimmer than Miss Firth's, the curtains drawn closer, the furniture arranged with less concern for appearance. There was a smell of old books and something faintly medicinal. "You have come about Eleanor," Mrs. Whitcomb said as they entered. "Yes." Mrs. Whitcomb did not ask further questions. She went to the fireplace, adjusted a small ornament, and then turned. "Everyone is very interested," she said. "It is unusual." "Indeed." "They will tell you about teacups and gates," Mrs. Whitcomb went on. "They will tell you what they saw and what they think they saw, but they will not tell you what matters." "And what is that?" Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Whitcomb's eyes rested on her for a moment. "What happened in October?" she said. The room seemed to settle around the words. Miss Marple did not move. "You know something of it?" she asked. Mrs. Whitcomb gave a small, almost weary smile. "I know enough to say that Miss Firth did not simply disappear," she said. "She was waiting for something." "For what?" For the past to catch up with her? Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around her handbag. Did it? Mrs. Whitcomb turned away. I think, she said quietly, that it did. There was a pause. Outside, somewhere down the street, a gate clicked shut. A voice called out, then fell silent. The village, so composed, seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple looked once more at Mrs. Whitcomb, at the careful stillness of her face, and felt the first clear shape of the matter forming. Not yet the solution, but the beginning of it. Miss Marple did not press Mrs. Whitcomb further that morning. It was not reluctance that held her back, but instinct. There are moments, she had often observed, when a question asked too soon closes more doors than it opens, and Mrs. Whitcomb, with her careful phrasing and guarded tone, was clearly a woman who did not respond well to pressure. Instead, Miss Marple allowed the conversation to drift. They spoke of Elmbridge, of its shops, its vicar, the state of the roads after rain. Mrs. Whitcomb answered politely, though without warmth. Mrs. Peabody, who had remained determinedly present, contributed several opinions of her own, particularly regarding the grocer's questionable onions and the postmistress's tendency to delay letters. But beneath the ordinary talk, something else persisted. That single phrase, what happened in October. When at last Miss Marple rose to leave, she did so with a gentle smile. You have been very kind, she said. Mrs. Whitcomb inclined her head. Kindness is not always useful, she replied. No, said Miss Marple softly, but it is rarely wasted. As she stepped back out onto Elm Street, the autumn light had sharpened. The leaves moved restlessly along the pavement, gathering in small, uncertain clusters. Somewhere, a clock struck 11. Mrs. Peabody drew close at once. Well, she said, what do you make of her? Miss Marple adjusted her glove. A very observant lady, she said. Mrs. Peabody sniffed. Observant, perhaps, but not helpful, always speaking in that vague way. The past, indeed, as though we all had skeletons in our cupboards. Miss Marple did not reply. They walked slowly down the street. At number 10, Mr. Briggs stood by his gate once more, clearly hoping for news. At number 4, the woman with the broom had progressed no further than she had earlier. Elm Street was waiting. Miss Marple paused briefly outside number 8. Tell me, she said, has anyone spoken with Miss Firth's relatives? Mrs. Peabody shook her head. As far as I know, she had none nearby. A cousin, perhaps, somewhere in Kent, but no one who visited. And this Agnes, the one mentioned in the letter, no idea at all, though I should like to know. Mrs. Peabody lowered her voice. It sounded rather serious, didn't it? Cannot be allowed to remain. Very ominous. Yes, said Miss Marple, it did. She stood for a moment longer, looking at the house, not directly, but in that quiet, sidelong way she had. October, she murmured. Mrs. Peabody followed her gaze. Well, if you ask me, she said briskly, nothing happened in October, not here at least. The harvest was late, there was that business with the church roof, and Mrs. Carter had influenza, but nothing of consequence. Of consequence, repeated Miss Marple softly. Yes, certainly nothing to do with Miss Firth. Miss Marple gave a small smile. Perhaps not, she said. That afternoon Miss Marple paid a visit to the post office. It was a small establishment, neat and well-stocked, presided over by Miss Eliza Granger, a woman of indeterminate age with a firm manner and a surprising fondness for gossip provided it was presented in a respectable form. Good afternoon, said Miss Marple. I wonder if you might assist me with a small inquiry. Miss Granger looked up, instantly alert. Of course, she said, if I can. I am trying to recall whether a Miss Eleanor Firth has sent or received any unusual correspondence in recent weeks. Miss Granger hesitated just long enough to appear cautious. Well, she said, one does not generally discuss private matters. However, she paused, arranging her expression into one of thoughtful discretion. There was a letter, about a fortnight ago. Yes. Registered post, from London. Miss Marple's eyes brightened very slightly. And was that unusual? Miss Firth did not often receive registered letters, Miss Granger said. Ordinary post, yes. Bills, circulars, but this one, she signed for it herself. Looked rather surprised, I thought. Did she mention the sender? No, though I did notice the handwriting on the envelope. Very firm, rather angular. Not a woman's hand, I should say." Miss Marple nodded. "And after that?" Miss Granger considered. She posted a letter of her own 2 days later, first class. "Quite early in the morning. To London?" "Yes." "Did you happen to see the address?" Miss Granger smiled faintly. "I am not in the habit of reading other people's letters," she said. "No, of course not. But," she added with a hint of satisfaction, "I did notice the name. Agnes. It was written quite clearly." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around her handbag. "Thank you," she said. "You have been most helpful." When Miss Marple returned to Miss Harmon's house, she found her hostess in a state of considerable agitation. "My dear Jane," Miss Harmon exclaimed, "you will never guess what has happened." "Something has," said Miss Marple calmly. "The police have found her handbag." Miss Marple stopped. "Where?" "In the lane behind the old orchard, just beyond the end of Elm Street. Inspector Hale came himself to tell us." "Oh, it is all most distressing." Miss Marple removed her gloves slowly. "And was anything missing?" "I don't believe so. Money, keys, everything still inside." "Everything?" "Yes." "Well?" Miss Harmon hesitated. "Not quite everything. Her purse, certainly, and her house keys, but no sign of the letter she had been writing, of course." "No," said Miss Marple quietly. "Of course not." Miss Harmon clasped her hands. "What do you think it means?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. She was thinking of the teacup, of the letter, of the registered post, of Mrs. Whitcomb's words. She was waiting for something. "Where exactly was the handbag found?" she asked. "In the lane, near the gate to the orchard." "Ah." Miss Marple moved to the window. Beyond the garden, the village lay in its usual arrangement of roofs and trees. It looked peaceful. It always did. But peace, Miss Marple knew, was often a matter of arrangement. "Lydia," she said gently, "did anything at all occur in Elmbridge in October? Anything out of the ordinary?" Miss Harmon frowned. October? Well, there was the church fete, of course, and the weather turned quite suddenly. "Oh, and there was that unfortunate business with Mr. Calder." Miss Marple turned. "Mr. Calder?" "Yes, a visitor. Stayed at the inn for a week or so. Quite charming, I thought. But then, well, he left rather abruptly." "Why?" Miss Harmon hesitated. "There were rumours," she said. "Nothing definite, you understand. Something about money, and a disagreement with one of the villagers, though I cannot recall with whom." Miss Marple was very still. "Did he know Miss Firth?" "I have no idea. Why should he?" "Why indeed?" said Miss Marple softly. That evening, as the lamps were lit along Elm Street and the last of the autumn light faded into shadow, Miss Marple took another walk. She did not go directly to number 8. Instead, she followed the lane behind the houses, the one that led to the old orchard. It was a narrow path, bordered by low hedges and scattered leaves. At the far end stood a wooden gate, slightly askew, beyond which the orchard stretched in quiet neglect. Miss Marple paused at the spot Miss Harmon had described. There was nothing obvious to see, no disturbance, no sign of struggle. But she stood there for several minutes, looking, not at the ground, but at the arrangement of things, the position of the gate, the line of the path, the way the houses on Elm Street overlooked the lane, and then she turned slowly, her gaze moving upward. Windows. From several of the houses the lane was clearly visible, number 11 in particular. Mrs. Whitcomb's house. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but something within her settled. "Everyone watches," she murmured. A leaf skittered across the path. In the distance, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Miss Marple turned back toward Elm Street. The pattern was not yet complete, but it was beginning to take shape, and at its centre, like a thread waiting to be drawn tight, lay a single question. What had happened in October, and who had been watching? The following morning brought with it a light rain, fine, persistent, and perfectly suited to contemplation. Elmbridge wore it quietly. The pavements darkened, the hedges gleamed, and the street seemed, if anything, more composed than before. Miss Marple, seated by the window with her knitting, did not knit very much. Her thoughts had arranged themselves into a small, orderly set of questions. The teacup, the unfinished letter, the registered post from London, the handbag left in the lane, and, most persistently of all, October. She had learned, over many years, that events rarely stood alone. They formed chains, each link attached to another, sometimes loosely, sometimes with a firmness that could not be broken. One had only to find the first link. Miss Harmon, who had been watching her with interest, finally spoke. "My dear Jane, you're thinking very hard." "I'm trying not to," said Miss Marple gently. "It is generally more useful." Miss Harmon gave a small laugh. "Well, if you can manage that, you're more accomplished than I. I have been thinking of nothing else since yesterday. That poor woman, vanishing like that. It is most unsettling." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "it is. And the handbag, left so neatly, as though it were meant to be found." Miss Marple looked up. "Quite," she said. Miss Harmon blinked. "You think so too?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that when something is placed in a conspicuous position, it is often because someone wishes it to be seen. Then you believe—" "I believe nothing as yet," Miss Marple interrupted softly. "But I should like to know more about Mr. Calder." Miss Harmon frowned. "The man who stayed at the inn? Oh, he was quite charming. Dark hair, very well spoken, a little too well dressed for the village, perhaps. But one sees that sort of thing nowadays. And you say he left abruptly?" "Yes. One day he was there, the next he was gone. No farewell, no explanation. Mrs. Dunning at the inn was quite put out." "Did he quarrel with anyone?" Miss Harmon hesitated. "There was talk," she said. "Nothing definite. Something about money. A disagreement with Mr. Finch, I believe, the solicitor. Though Mr. Finch is not one to quarrel, so it must have been quite serious." Miss Marple set aside her knitting. "I think," she said, rising, "that I should very much like to speak with Mrs. Dunning." The Elmbridge Inn stood at the edge of the village, a solid, respectable building with a low roof and a sign that creaked gently in the damp air. Inside it was warm and faintly scented with polish and coffee. Mrs. Dunning was behind the counter, a broad woman with capable hands and a practical expression. "Yes," she said. Miss Marple smiled. "Good morning. I wonder if I might trouble you with a few questions about a former guest of yours, Mr. Calder." Mrs. Dunning's eyebrows rose. "Mr. Calder, is it? Well, he's not been here these 3 weeks or more." "So I understand." Mrs. Dunning wiped her hands on her apron. "What is it you want to know?" "Only whether he left any impression behind him," said Miss Marple. "He seems to have been memorable." Mrs. Dunning gave a short laugh. "That's one way of putting it. He was a smooth one, that man. Polite as you like, but always watching. Not the sort to sit easy." "Watching?" Miss Marple echoed. "Yes, not in a rude way, you understand. Just noticing things. Who came and went? Who spoke to whom? That sort of thing." Miss Marple's eyes grew thoughtful. "And did he speak much of himself?" "Very little. Said he was in business. London, I believe. But there was something about him." Mrs. Dunning paused, searching for the word. "Unsettled?" Miss Marple suggested. "Yes," said Mrs. Dunning at once. "That's it. As though he were waiting for something." Miss Marple felt a small inward tightening. "And the disagreement you mentioned?" Mrs. Dunning's expression changed. "That was with Mr. Finch, in the sitting room. I didn't hear the whole of it, but there was talk of documents and money. Mr. Finch was very firm, said something about not being party to it. Mr. Calder didn't like that." "Did Miss Firth know Mr. Calder?" Mrs. Dunning hesitated. "I couldn't say for certain, but I did see her speak to him once, out by the lane. They weren't arguing exactly, but it wasn't friendly." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Thank you," she said. "You have been most helpful." As she turned to leave, Mrs. Dunning added, "If you ask me, that man had trouble following him, and trouble has a way of catching up." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "It does." That afternoon Miss Marple called upon Mr. Finch. His office was small but orderly, filled with neat stacks of papers and the faint smell of ink. Mr. Finch himself was a thin, precise man with spectacles and an air of quiet authority. "Miss Marple," he said, rising, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" "I hope I'm not intruding," she said. "I wish to ask you about Mr. Calder." Mr. Finch's expression did not change, but something in it sharpened. "I'm not sure I can assist you," he said. "Of course," said Miss Marple. "It is only that I understand there was some discussion between you in October." Mr. Finch hesitated. "It was nothing of consequence," he said. Miss Marple looked at him steadily. "I find," she said gently, "that things which appear of no consequence are often the most important." There was a pause. Mr. Finch removed his spectacles, polished them, and replaced them carefully. Mr. Calder approached me regarding a certain matter, he said. A document. He wished it to be formalized. And you declined? Yes. Why? Mr. Finch's mouth tightened. Because it was not proper, he said. In what way? I'm not at liberty to discuss the details. Miss Marple inclined her head. Of course not, she rose. But you believe it was connected to Miss Firth? Mr. Finch hesitated again. I believe, he said slowly, that Miss Firth was involved in something she did not fully understand, and that Mr. Calder intended to take advantage of that. Miss Marple's eyes softened. And you warned her? I attempted to. Did she listen? Mr. Finch looked away. I do not know, he said. As evening fell, Miss Marple returned once more to Elm Street. The rain had stopped, the air was clear, and the street lay in its usual arrangement of light and shadow. Lamps glowed behind curtains, doors were closed, everything appeared as it should. And yet, Miss Marple paused outside number 11. Mrs. Whitcomb's window was lit. For a moment Miss Marple stood very still. Then she crossed the street and knocked. Mrs. Whitcomb opened the door almost at once. You have come again, she said. Yes. Mrs. Whitcomb stepped aside. You are beginning to see it, she said as Miss Marple entered. Something of it, Miss Marple replied. The man from October, Mrs. Whitcomb said. You have heard of him? Yes. And you think he is connected? I think, said Miss Marple carefully, that he may be one of the links in the chain. Mrs. Whitcomb gave a faint smile. A chain, she repeated. Yes, that is a good word. She moved to the window and looked out across the street at number 8. He came, she said, and he went. But not everything he brought with him went away. Miss Marple followed her gaze. What did he bring? She asked softly. Mrs. Whitcomb did not answer at once. When she did, her voice was very quiet. Fear, she said. The words seemed to settle into the room. Miss Marple did not speak. She knew, Mrs. Whitcomb went on. Miss Firth. She knew something was wrong. That is why she began the letter. To Agnes? Yes. Who is Agnes? Mrs. Whitcomb turned. A name from her past, she said. Someone who would understand. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly. And you? She asked. What do you understand, Mrs. Whitcomb? There was a long pause. Mrs. Whitcomb looked at her. Really looked. For the first time. I understand, she said slowly, that when people are watched long enough, they begin to behave as though they are being watched. Miss Marple felt a quiet certainty settle within her. And Miss Firth was being watched, she said. Mrs. Whitcomb did not deny it. Outside, a curtain shifted. A door closed softly somewhere down the street. Elm Street, so neat, so orderly, so observant, was not as quiet as it appeared. And someone, Miss Marple thought, had been watching very closely indeed. Miss Marple slept very little that night. It was not discomfort that kept her awake, nor even anxiety, she was long accustomed to both, but rather a quiet persistence of thought. The sort that returns again and again to the same small detail, turning it slightly each time, examining it from a different angle until something within it yields. The teacup. It was, on the surface, a trivial matter, a preference, a habit. And yet habits, Miss Marple knew, were the strongest indicators of a person's true nature. They were the things one did without thinking. Miss Eleanor Firth, by all accounts, had been a woman of habit, so why change it? Morning brought with it a pale sunlight and a sense of movement. The village, which had held itself in a kind of suspended curiosity, now seemed to lean forward slightly, as though expecting something to happen. Miss Harmon entered the sitting room with unusual briskness. My dear Jane, she said, you will not believe it. The police are returning to Elm Street today. Inspector Hale has decided to make further inquiries. How very sensible, said Miss Marple. Yes, though I cannot imagine what more there is to find. The house has already been examined, the handbag discovered, and still, nothing. Miss Harmon lowered herself into a chair. It is most unsatisfactory. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, she said, it is. After breakfast, she made her way once more to number 8. This time the front door was open, and Inspector Hale stood just inside, speaking to the constable in low tones. He looked up as Miss Marple approached. Yes, he said. Miss Marple inclined her head. I hope I'm not intruding, she said. I wondered if I might be permitted a brief look at the sitting room, Inspector Hale regarded her for a moment. "And you are?" "Miss Marple. I am staying with Miss Harmon." He nodded. "Yes, I have heard of you." His tone suggested that what he had heard was not entirely reassuring. "Very well, but I must ask that you do not disturb anything." "Of course." Miss Marple stepped inside. The sitting room had been left much as it was. The teapot, the cup, the escritoire, all in their places. But there was a subtle difference now, a sense that the room had been observed, catalogued, reduced to a series of facts. Miss Marple moved slowly. She did not begin with the obvious. Instead, she went to the fireplace. The grate was cold now, the ashes grey and settled. She crouched slightly, examining them, not touching, merely looking. Then she rose and turned to the small table beside it, the teapot. She lifted the lid. There was still a faint scent of tea, though the liquid itself had been discarded. She replaced the lid carefully and turned to the cup. Again, plain white. Again, unremarkable. But Miss Marple did not look at the cup, she looked at the saucer. There was a faint ring upon it, not the clean circular mark left by a cup properly placed, but something slightly irregular, as though the cup had been set down carelessly, or by someone unused to the habit. Miss Marple straightened. "Inspector Hale," she said. He turned. "Yes?" "May I ask, was the tea tested?" "For what?" he asked, frowning. "For anything that should not have been in it." Hale's expression shifted. "You think she was poisoned?" "I think it is worth considering." He hesitated. "We have no evidence of that," he said. "No body, for one thing." "No," said Miss Marple. "No body." She moved to the escritoire. The unfinished letter lay where it had been. "My dear Agnes, I have been thinking for some time that what happened in October cannot be allowed to remain." Miss Marple read it once more. "Inspector," she said quietly, "do you find it natural that a woman should begin such a sentence, and then leave it unfinished?" Hale shrugged. "People are interrupted." "Yes, but interrupted by what?" He did not answer. Miss Marple turned slightly, her gaze moving over the room. "There is something else," she said. "The letter mentions October. We know that a man, Mr. Calder, was in the village at that time. He had dealings with Miss Firth. There was some matter involving documents. And Miss Firth received a registered letter from London shortly before her disappearance." Hale's brow furrowed. "You seem to know a good deal." "One hears things," said Miss Marple mildly. He considered this. "Very well," he said. "Suppose there is a connection. What does it tell us?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she moved to the cupboard and opened it. Inside, the blue-patterned cup sat exactly where it had been before. She took it out. The crack along the rim was fine but visible, a familiar object, a constant. She turned it in her hands, then placed it gently beside the white cup on the table. "2 cups," she said softly. Hale frowned. "There was only one used." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but there are 2 here." He looked at her. "And?" Miss Marple met his gaze. "A woman who lives alone," she said, "and who has used the same cup every morning for years does not suddenly choose another without reason." "And the reason?" Miss Marple's voice was very quiet. "She was not alone." The words seemed to settle into the room. Hale's expression changed. "You mean someone was here with her?" "Yes." "And you think that person—" "What?" "Switched the cup." "I think," said Miss Marple, "that Miss Firth may not have poured the tea herself." There was a long pause. Hale looked again at the cup, the saucer, the teapot, and the letter. "Perhaps she began it before her visitor arrived," Miss Marple said, "or perhaps she intended to finish it after they had gone." "And did not get the chance?" "No," Hale exhaled slowly. "This is all very speculative," he said. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "It is, but," he hesitated, "it does suggest something more than a voluntary disappearance." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes." He turned to the constable. "Send the tea things for analysis," he said. "And I want a list of anyone who visited Miss Firth in the past fortnight, particularly anyone from outside the village." "Yes, sir." Miss Marple watched him for a moment. "You're very thorough, Inspector," she said. He gave a short smile. "I prefer facts to speculation, Miss Marple." "As do I," she replied gently. "But one must sometimes follow the speculation to find the facts." That afternoon, Miss Marple returned once more to Mrs. Whitcomb. This time she did not wait to be invited in. "I think," she said as she entered, "that Miss Firth had a visitor on the morning she disappeared." Mrs. Whitcomb regarded her steadily. "Yes," she said. Miss Marple did not seem surprised. "And you saw this visitor?" Mrs. Whitcomb's eyes flickered just slightly. "I saw someone," she said. "From your window." "Yes." "Who was it?" There was a pause. Mrs. Whitcomb moved to her chair and sat down slowly. "I did not see their face," she said. "Only their back. A dark coat. A hat. A man? I believe so." Miss Marple nodded. "And did Miss Firth let him in willingly?" "Yes." "How can you be sure?" Mrs. Whitcomb looked at her. "Because she opened the door before he knocked," she said. Miss Marple's fingers tightened. "She was expecting him." "Yes." There was a long silence. "And after he left?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Whitcomb didn't answer at once. When she did, her voice was very quiet. "He did not leave the way he came." Miss Marple felt something shift. "What do you mean?" "I watched the front door," Mrs. Whitcomb said. "It did not open again." Miss Marple's mind moved quickly. "The back," she said. "Yes." "The lane." "Yes." "The handbag." Mrs. Whitcomb inclined her head. Miss Marple stood very still. "And Miss Firth?" she asked softly. Mrs. Whitcomb's gaze did not waver. "I did not see her leave," she said. The room seemed to grow colder. Miss Marple drew a slow breath. "No," she said. "I suppose you did not." Because if Mrs. Whitcomb had been watching, and Miss Firth had not left by the front, then there was only one possibility left. Miss Marple turned toward the window. Across the street, number 8 stood in its quiet, orderly place. But now, for the first time, it no longer looked merely silent. It looked closed, as though it held something inside. Something that had not yet been found. Miss Marple did not go back to Miss Harmon's house at once. Instead, she remained standing by Mrs. Whitcomb's window for several moments, her eyes resting quietly on number 8 across the street. The house seemed unchanged, composed, respectable, entirely in keeping with Elm Street's careful order. And yet, once a thing has been seen differently, it cannot return to its former state. "Closed," Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Whitcomb said nothing. Miss Marple turned at last. "You have been watching that house very closely," she said gently. "Yes. And yet you didn't speak of what you saw." "No." "Why?" Mrs. Whitcomb's expression did not alter, but something in her voice shifted, just slightly. "Because," she said, "it is not my habit to interfere in matters that do not concern me." Miss Marple gave a faint, almost regretful smile. "My dear Mrs. Whitcomb," she said, "they always concern us in the end." There was a pause. "And now?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Do you think it concerns you now?" Mrs. Whitcomb did not reply, but her eyes moved, just once, toward number 8. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Thank you," she said quietly, and left. Inspector Hale was still at the house. He stood in the hallway, speaking sharply to the constable when Miss Marple entered once more. He looked up, clearly prepared to object, but something in her expression gave him pause. "Yes," he said. "I believe," said Miss Marple calmly, "that Miss Firth may still be in the house." There was a moment of complete stillness, then Hale frowned. "That is impossible," he said. "We have already searched." "Have you searched?" Miss Marple interrupted gently. "For something that is meant to be hidden?" Hale's expression hardened. "We searched thoroughly." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but you were searching for signs of departure, not for absence." He stared at her. "What do you suggest?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. Instead, she moved slowly into the sitting room, her eyes passing over the familiar arrangement, the teacup, the escritoire, the quiet, ordered surfaces. Then she turned. "May I see the kitchen?" she asked. Hale hesitated, then gestured. "This way." The kitchen was small, neat, and entirely unremarkable at first glance. The kettle stood on the stove. The sink was empty. A row of jars lined the shelf above the counter. Miss Marple moved to the back door. She examined the lock, the handle, the key. "Was this door locked?" she asked. "Yes," said Hale. "The key was inside." "After the handbag was found in the lane?" "Yes." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And the garden?" "Nothing unusual. The gate was slightly ajar, but no signs of disturbance." Miss Marple stepped outside. The garden was narrow, bordered by damp earth and low shrubs. The path ran straight to the gate, which stood now firmly closed. She walked its length carefully. At the far end, she paused. The gate opened onto the lane, quiet, overlooked, easily observed from the windows of Elm Street. She turned back. "Inspector," she said, "if a person wished to leave this house without being seen, would this be the way to do it?" "Yes," he said at once. "That is why we assumed. But if someone wished to be seen leaving," Miss Marple continued, "this would also be the way." Hale frowned. "I do not follow." Miss Marple stepped back inside. "The handbag," she said, "placed in the lane, clearly visible, containing everything of value. It suggests departure, but does not prove it." Hale crossed his arms. "You think it was planted?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that it was arranged." She moved slowly around the kitchen. Her eyes came to rest on a narrow door near the pantry. "What is this?" she asked. Hale glanced at it. "Pantry," he said. "We looked inside, nothing there." "May I?" He nodded. Miss Marple opened the door. The pantry was small, lined with shelves. Jars, tins, a few folded cloths. Nothing unusual. And yet... Miss Marple stepped inside. She stood very still. Then she looked down. The floor was covered with a plain linoleum, worn but clean. Too clean. She bent slightly. "Inspector," she said quietly, "would you come here?" Hale stepped forward. "What is it?" Miss Marple pointed. "There," she said. At first he saw nothing. Then a faint line. Not a crack. Not a stain. A seam. Running across the floor, just slightly off-centre. Hale crouched. "Good God," he muttered. Miss Marple stepped back. "Some houses," she said gently, "particularly older ones, have cellars or storage spaces beneath the kitchen. They are not always obvious." Hale rose at once. "Constable," he called, "fetch a tool. We're lifting this." The constable hurried off. The room seemed to tighten around them. Miss Marple stood very quietly, her hands folded, her eyes lowered, not in avoidance but in acknowledgement of what might be found. Mrs. Peabody appeared in the doorway, breathless. "What is happening?" she demanded. "No one is to enter," Hale said sharply, but she remained watching, as did others. The news had already begun to spread. Within minutes the constable returned with a crowbar. Hale knelt, inserted it into the narrow seam and applied pressure. The linoleum lifted. Beneath it, wood, a hatch. The room fell completely silent. Hale grasped the edge and pulled. The hatch opened with a low, reluctant sound. A faint, stale air rose from below. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, not in fear, but in certainty. Hale took a lantern from the constable and held it over the opening. A narrow set of steps led downward into darkness. He descended first. The constable followed. Miss Marple remained where she was. She did not need to see. She already knew. There are certain patterns that do not lie. Above her, the house stood quiet, perfectly ordered, perfectly composed. Below, the truth had been waiting. There was a long silence. Then, a voice. Low, controlled, but unmistakable. "Inspector," Hale's voice from below. "She's here." Mrs. Peabody gasped. The room seemed to shift. Miss Marple opened her eyes, and though she did not move, something within her settled completely. Because now, they were no longer searching for a disappearance. They were investigating a murder. No one on Elm Street forgot the sound of that moment. Not the sharp intake of breath from Mrs. Peabody. Not the hurried scuffle of shoes as neighbours gathered in the doorway. Not even the way the house itself seemed to settle, as though something long held in silence had finally been acknowledged. Miss Marple did not move at once. She stood where she was, her hands lightly clasped, her gaze resting not on the open hatch, but on the small, ordinary details around her. The jar of sugar on the shelf, the folded cloth by the sink, the quiet domestic order that had been so carefully preserved. It was always like this, she thought. The surface immaculate, the truth beneath. Inspector Hale emerged a few minutes later. His face had changed. Not dramatically. He was not a man given to outward displays, but there was a stiffness in him now, a certain restraint that had not been present before. "Well?" Mrs. Peabody demanded, unable to contain herself. Hale looked at her once briefly. "You should go home, Mrs. Peabody," he said. "I most certainly will not." "You should," he repeated more firmly. For once she obeyed. The constable followed him up from the cellar, his expression pale. Behind them the hatch remained open, dark, silent, undeniable. Hale turned to Miss Marple. "You were right," he said. Miss Marple inclined her head. "I am sorry that I was," she replied gently. He studied her for a moment. "How did you know?" he asked. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer to the table, resting her hand lightly against its edge. "I did not know," she said, "but I suspected." "Because she was not seen leaving?" "Yes, and because the signs of departure were too carefully arranged." Hale nodded slowly. "The handbag?" he said. "Yes." "And the lane?" "Yes." He looked toward the open hatch. "And this?" Miss Marple's eyes followed his. "This," she said quietly, "was never meant to be found." There was a pause. "Not at once," she added. Hale exhaled. "We'll need a full examination," he said. "Time of death, cause, everything." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Of course." He hesitated. "You believe she was killed in the house?" "I believe," Miss Marple replied, "that she was not allowed to leave it." By afternoon, Elm Street had transformed. Where once there had been quiet curiosity, there was now something sharper, something that moved beneath the surface of conversation and showed itself only in glances, in lowered voices, in the sudden closing of doors. The police had sealed number 8. A small crowd had gathered and dispersed and gathered again, each person carrying away a slightly altered version of the truth. Miss Firth had not disappeared. She had been there all along. Miss Marple returned to Miss Harmon's house, where she was received with a mixture of alarm and fascination. "My dear Jane," Miss Harmon said, clutching her hand, "is it true? They say— oh, I hardly like to repeat it, but they say she was found." "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. Miss Harmon sank into a chair. "How dreadful! And to think we all believed—" "Yes," said Miss Marple, "we did." There was a silence. "And you suspected it?" Miss Harmon asked. "I suspected," Miss Marple said, "that something had been concealed." Miss Harmon shivered. "In the house," she said, "all that time." "Yes." Miss Harmon pressed her hands together. "But who could have done such a thing?" Miss Marple did not answer. Not yet. Later that evening, Inspector Hale came to call. He was tired now, the edges of his composure worn thin by the day's events. "We have a preliminary report," he said. "Miss Firth died the morning she disappeared, likely within an hour of her last known activity." "The tea?" said Miss Marple. "Yes. We believe she was given something, a sedative perhaps, something to render her unconscious." "And then?" Hale's mouth tightened. "Strangled." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "I see." "There are no signs of a struggle," Hale continued, "which supports the theory. She would not have been able to resist." "No," said Miss Marple quietly. "She would not." Hale looked at her. "We've begun questioning the neighbours," he said. "Everyone on Elm Street. No one reports seeing anything unusual. No one admits to visitors." Miss Marple's expression did not change. "No," she said. "I expect not." "You spoke to Mrs. Whitcomb," Hale added. "She claims to have seen a man enter the house." "Yes, but she cannot identify him." "No." Hale frowned. "She also says she did not see Miss Firth leave." "That is correct." "And yet no one saw anything from the back either. The lane was empty." Miss Marple's gaze lifted. "Was it?" she asked softly. Hale hesitated. "That is what they say." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "that is what they say." There was a pause. "Inspector," she said, "may I ask, have you considered the possibility that the person who placed the handbag in the lane did so knowing exactly who would see it?" Hale looked at her sharply. "You mean someone on Elm Street?" "Yes." "Watching from the windows?" "Yes." Hale was silent. "And you think that person— what? Returned to the house?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that the person who committed the crime was familiar with the house. Familiar enough to know of the cellar. Familiar enough to move within it without hesitation." Hale nodded slowly. "That limits our field," he said. "Yes." "To the neighbours?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes." That night, Elm Street did not sleep easily. Lights remained on longer than usual, curtains were drawn more tightly. The ordinary sounds of the village, footsteps, doors, distant voices, seemed sharper, more deliberate. Across the street, Mrs. Whitcomb stood once more at her window. She had not moved for some time. The light behind her cast her reflection faintly against the glass. A pale outline, watching. Miss Marple, passing by on her evening walk, paused. For a moment the two women regarded one another across the quiet street. Then Miss Marple spoke. "You saw more than you have said," she called gently. Mrs. Whitcomb did not move. "You saw him leave," Miss Marple continued, "or you saw something that made you believe he had." A long silence followed. Then Mrs. Whitcomb spoke, not loudly, but clearly enough. "I saw the gate move," she said. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And you assumed that someone had gone through it?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "But you did not see them?" "No." Miss Marple took a step closer. "And if no one passed through the gate," she said, "then the person who placed the handbag was already outside," Mrs. Whitcomb finished. "Yes." Another silence. "And if they were already outside," Miss Marple said softly, "then they must have left the house before the time you were watching." Mrs. Whitcomb's gaze did not waver. "Yes." "Which means," Miss Marple continued, "that there was more than one person involved." The words hung in the air. For the first time, Mrs. Whitcomb's expression shifted, just slightly. "You are very perceptive," she said. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "No," she said, "only attentive." She turned to go, but as she did, she added, almost as an afterthought, "Two people, Mrs. Whitcomb, one inside, one outside." She paused, "and both of them known to Elm Street." The door at number 11 closed quietly. Miss Marple walked on. The pattern was no longer vague. It was forming. Two people, one crime, and a street full of watchers, one of whom, she thought, had been watching not just Miss Firth, but everyone. The rain returned in the night, not heavy enough to wash anything clean, but sufficient to blur edges and soften sounds. Elm Street woke under a dim sky, each house wearing its quiet like a carefully chosen coat. Miss Marple sat by Miss Harmon's window, her knitting resting untouched in her lap. Two people. The thought had settled firmly now, not as speculation, but as structure. One inside, one outside, one to act, one to observe. It was a very simple arrangement, really, and simplicity, Miss Marple knew, was often the most dangerous thing of all. Miss Harmon entered with a tray. "My dear Jane, you look quite pale," she said. "This business is becoming too much for you." "On the contrary," said Miss Marple gently, "it is becoming clearer." Miss Harmon placed the tray down. "Clearer? Then you must tell me everything at once." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I should like to tell you something first," she said. "About a village I once knew. A very quiet place. Respectable. Much like Elmbridge." Miss Harmon settled into her chair. "And what happened there? A woman lived alone," Miss Marple said. "Very proper, very consistent in her habits. She had a neighbour who watched everything, out of curiosity, of course. Quite innocent." Miss Harmon nodded. "There is always someone like that." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "And there was also a man, charming, agreeable, but with a certain restlessness. He came and went. No one paid him much attention. And then, one day," Miss Marple continued, "the woman was found dead, quietly, without disturbance, and the entire village was quite astonished." Miss Harmon leaned forward. "And who did it?" Miss Marple looked at her. "The man," she said. "And the neighbour?" Miss Harmon blinked. "Both?" "Yes, one could not have managed alone." "But why?" Miss Marple's fingers moved lightly over the wool. "Because the man needed access," she said, "and the neighbour needed something else." Miss Harmon frowned. "I do not understand." "No," said Miss Marple, "not yet." That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to Elm Street. She did not go to number 8. Instead, she walked slowly from one end of the street to the other, her eyes moving over the houses, the windows, the small details that so often revealed more than the larger ones. At number 6, Mrs. Peabody was in her doorway once more. "My dear Miss Marple," she said, "what a dreadful business. I hardly slept a wink." "I am sure," said Miss Marple. "They say there were two people involved," Mrs. Peabody went on eagerly. "Can you imagine? On this street." Yes, said Miss Marple softly. I can imagine it very well. Mrs. Peabody lowered her voice. And have you any idea who they might be? Miss Marple smiled. Only that they must be people who are trusted, she said. Mrs. Peabody drew herself up. Well, I should hope so, she said. We are not the sort of place to harbour strangers. No, said Miss Marple, you are not. She moved on. At number 10, Mr. Briggs stood once again by his gate. Miss Marple, he said, this is most unsettling. To think, someone among us. Yes, said Miss Marple, it is unsettling. And two of them, they say. Yes, Mr. Briggs shook his head. I cannot imagine such a thing. No, said Miss Marple gently. It is very difficult to imagine, she continued on. At last she stopped at number 11. Mrs. Whitcomb's curtains were drawn, but not completely. A narrow gap remained. Miss Marple did not knock. Instead, she stood for a moment, looking, not at the house, but at the line of sight from the window across the street. From here, one could see the front door of number 8, the path, the lane beyond, everything. She turned slowly, and then she saw it. Not in Mrs. Whitcomb's house, but in the house next door, number 10, Mr. Briggs's house, the angle. From his upstairs window one could see not only the front of number 8, but also the back gate. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but something within her settled, the second pair of eyes. She returned to Miss Harmon's house at once. Inspector Hale was already there. Miss Marple, he said, rising, I was just about to come and see you. Yes, she said, and I was about to come and see you. They looked at one another. You first, he said. Miss Marple inclined her head. You are looking for two people, she said. One inside the house, one outside. Yes. The one inside needed access, she continued. They were admitted willingly. Miss Firth expected them. Mr. Calder, Hale said. Yes. And the second? Miss Marple's voice was very quiet. The second did not enter the house, she said. They watched. From where? From Elm Street. Hale frowned. You think one of the neighbours was involved? I think, said Miss Marple, that one of the neighbours knew exactly what was happening and assisted in it. In what way? Miss Marple stepped closer. The handbag, she said, placed in the lane at the right moment to suggest departure. Hale's eyes narrowed. And you believe this neighbour, what? Went out after the crime? Yes. And returned unnoticed? Yes. Hale was silent. Which neighbour? He asked at last. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she went to the window. Elm Street lay quiet beyond it, orderly, respectable, watching. There are two watchers on that street, she said softly. One who sees everything and says very little. Mrs. Whitcomb? Yes. And the other? Miss Marple turned. The one who wishes to be seen as harmless, she said. The one who is always present, but never suspected. Hale's expression sharpened. Mr. Briggs. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes. Hale exhaled slowly. He found the handbag, he said. Yes. And he was there at the right time. Yes. And if he could see the back gate, he would know when to act. Hale ran a hand over his face. Then Calder enters the house, he said slowly. Miss Firth lets him in. Something happens. He gives her something in the tea. She's incapacitated. He kills her. Yes. And then? He leaves, said Miss Marple, by the front, while Mrs. Whitcomb is watching. Hale frowned. But she said she did not see him leave, Miss Marple interrupted gently. But she also said she did not see his face. Hale was very still. And Mr. Briggs? He watches from his window, Miss Marple said. He knows when Calder has gone. He goes out to the lane. He places the handbag. He creates the illusion of departure. And returns. Yes. Hale's voice was low. Two people, he said. Yes. And both on Elm Street. Miss Marple's eyes were very calm. Yes. There was a long silence. Then Hale straightened. I think, he said, it is time we spoke to Mr. Briggs. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said, I think it is. Because now the pattern was complete. All that remained was the truth. Mr. Leonard Briggs received them with mild surprise. Well now, he said, stepping back from the doorway of number 10, this is a turn. Inspector, and Miss Marple too, do come in. Most unfortunate business, most unfortunate. His voice was steady, his manner perfectly polite. There was nothing in him, at first glance, to suggest anything beyond the ordinary. That, Miss Marple thought, was precisely the difficulty. The sitting room was neat, almost excessively so, books aligned, cushions plumped, a fire laid with care, though not yet lit. Mr. Briggs gestured toward the chairs. "Pray sit down. I was just about to take tea, though I dare say that is rather a sensitive subject at present." He gave a small, nervous laugh. Inspector Hale did not sit. "Mr. Briggs," he said, "we would like to ask you a few questions about the morning Miss Firth disappeared." "Of course," said Mr. Briggs at once. "Anything I can do, though I fear I have already told the police everything I know." "Perhaps," said Hale, "you might tell it again." Mr. Briggs smiled faintly and folded his hands. "Well, I saw nothing unusual, I'm afraid. I was in my room most of the morning, reading. I heard nothing, saw nothing. Only later, when Mrs. Peabody raised the alarm, did I become aware that anything was amiss." Miss Marple, who had seated herself quietly near the window, looked at him with mild interest. "And the handbag?" she asked. Mr. Briggs turned to her. Yes, I found it in the lane. Quite by chance, you understand. I had gone out for a short walk, a most distressing sight. You noticed it at once. Well, it was lying there, rather conspicuously." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. Inspector Hale took a step forward. "Mr. Briggs," he said, "from your upstairs window, you have a clear view of the lane behind number 8, do you not?" Mr. Briggs hesitated, just slightly. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I suppose one does." "And were you at that window on the morning in question?" "No," said Mr. Briggs quickly. "As I said, I was reading." Miss Marple spoke again, her tone as gentle as ever. "Such a pleasant occupation," she said, "though one does occasionally glance up." Mr. Briggs gave a small polite laugh. Yes, one does." "And did you?" she asked. There was a pause. "Not particularly," he said. Miss Marple tilted her head. "How curious," she murmured. Inspector Hale's voice hardened. "We have reason to believe," he said, "that someone placed Miss Firth's handbag in the lane after her death, at a time when it would be easily seen." Mr. Briggs's hands tightened slightly. "Is that so?" he said. "Yes," said Hale, "and that this person would have known exactly when to do so." Mr. Briggs's smile had faded. "I do not see what this has to do with me." Miss Marple looked at him. "Because," she said softly, "you were in the perfect position to know." There was a long silence. Mr. Briggs stood very still. "I think," he said slowly, "that you are mistaken." Miss Marple did not argue. Instead, she rose and moved toward the window. "Such a clear view," she said. "One can see the entire lane, the gate, even the back door of number 8 if it is open." Mr. Briggs said nothing. "And one might also see," she continued, "if someone were to leave the house by the front, and another were to leave something in the lane shortly afterward." Inspector Hale watched him closely. "Mr. Briggs," he said, "did you see Mr. Calder leave Miss Firth's house?" The name landed heavily in the room. Mr. Briggs's face changed, only slightly, but enough. I do not know any Mr. Calder," he said. Miss Marple turned. "No?" she said. "How very odd. Because he was seen speaking with Miss Firth in October, and he was staying at the inn. A noticeable man, I'm told." Mr. Briggs swallowed. "I may have seen him in passing," he said. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I think you may have." There was another silence, and then something shifted, not outwardly, not dramatically, but inwardly. Mr. Briggs's shoulders lowered, just a fraction. The tension in his hands eased. When he spoke again, his voice was different, quieter. "I did not kill her," he said. Inspector Hale stepped forward. "But you know who did?" Mr. Briggs closed his eyes briefly. "Yes," he said. Miss Marple didn't move. "And you helped," Hale said. Mr. Briggs's eyes opened. "I didn't help," he said sharply. "Not at first. I only watched." Miss Marple's voice was very gentle. "You always watched," she said. He looked at her, and for the first time there was something like recognition in his gaze. "Yes," he said. "I did." There was a pause. "Tell us," said Hale. Mr. Briggs sank slowly into a chair. "He came that morning," he said, "just as she expected him. I saw her open the door before he knocked. That was how it began." "Mr. Calder," said Hale. "Yes?" What did he want? Mr. Briggs shook his head. I do not know exactly. Something to do with money. Documents. He had been trying to persuade her since October, but she was not a foolish woman. She resisted him. Miss Marple nodded slightly. And that morning? Mr. Briggs's voice dropped. They argued, he said. Not loudly, but I could see it. The way they moved, the way she stood. And then? He stayed, Mr. Briggs said. Longer than before. Too long. And you watched. Yes. Miss Marple's eyes were steady. What happened next? Mr. Briggs hesitated. I did not see it clearly, he said. Only, he moved toward the table, the tea, and then she sat down. And after that? She did not move, Mr. Briggs said. The room was very still. And Mr. Calder? Hale asked. He left, Mr. Briggs said. By the front door, just as Mrs. Whitcomb said. She was watching. I saw her at the window. Miss Marple's gaze flickered. And you? She asked. Mr. Briggs looked at her. I waited, he said. For what? For him to be gone, Mr. Briggs replied. For the street to settle, for no one to be looking. And then? I went to the lane, he said. I took her handbag. He had left it near the back and I placed it where it would be found. Why? Hale demanded. Mr. Briggs's voice broke slightly. Because it seemed easier, he said. If it looked like she had gone. If no one looked too closely. Miss Marple did not speak. And the cellar? Hale asked. Mr. Briggs shook his head. I did not know, he said. Not then. There was a silence. Then Hale said, You understand that what you did makes you an accessory. Yes, said Mr. Briggs. And Mr. Calder, Hale continued, where is he now? Mr. Briggs looked up. I do not know, he said. He left the village that same day. Miss Marple stepped forward. But you expected him to return, she said. Mr. Briggs blinked. What? The handbag, she said, placed so carefully, not merely to suggest departure, but to delay discovery, to give him time. Mr. Briggs stared at her. You thought he would come back, she said softly, to finish what he had begun, or to remove something he had left behind. Mr. Briggs's face had gone pale. I did not think, he began. No, said Miss Marple gently. You did not think it through. You only watched. The words hung in the air. Inspector Hale straightened. We will need to locate Mr. Calder, he said. Immediately. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said. I think you will find him closer than you expect. Hale frowned. What do you mean? Miss Marple's eyes moved, not to Mr. Briggs, but to the door. Because, she said quietly, a man who leaves something unfinished rarely goes very far. There was a knock, sharp, unexpected. All three turned. The constable stood in the doorway. Inspector, he said. We've had a report from the station. Hale stepped forward. Yes? A man matching Calder's description, the constable said, was seen returning to Elmbridge this morning. The room seemed to tighten. Miss Marple's voice was very soft. Yes, she said. I thought he might. Because the story was not yet finished, and the man who had begun it had come back to end it. The news travelled faster than it ought to have. Before Inspector Hale had even reached the gate of number 10, a quiet ripple had already moved along Elm Street. Curtains shifted. Doors opened. Just a fraction. A presence, unseen but unmistakable, seemed to pass from house to house. He has come back. Miss Marple walked beside the inspector, her steps measured, her expression calm. Mr. Briggs followed at a distance, pale and subdued, watched closely by the constable. Where was he seen? Hale asked. At the station, sir, the constable replied. Just after 10, he didn't linger, took the road toward the village. Did anyone speak to him? No, sir, but Mrs. Larkin recognised him, said she was certain. Hale nodded sharply. He's come back for something, he said. Yes, said Miss Marple quietly. He has. They reached Elm Street. It looked as it always had. Orderly, composed, respectable. But beneath that surface, something had shifted again. Miss Marple slowed. Inspector, she said, if Mr. Calder has returned, he will not go to the inn. No? No. He will go where he believes his business is unfinished. Hale's eyes moved to number 8. The house. Yes. And if he finds the police there? Miss Marple's gaze was steady. He will not go to the front. Hale turned. The lane, he said. Yes. They moved quickly now, circling the row of houses and entering the narrow path behind Elm Street. The hedges were still damp from the morning rain. The ground was soft beneath their feet. At the far end, the gate to Miss Firth's garden stood slightly open. Hale stopped. "Careful," he said. The constable stepped forward, and then a sound, faint, from within the garden, a movement. Miss Marple did not speak. She only watched. Hale gestured. The constable moved through the gate. There was a moment of silence, then, "Sir." Hale followed at once. Miss Marple came after, slower. In the narrow garden near the back door a man stood. He had turned at the sound, tall, dark hair, well dressed, though not as carefully as before. There was something restless in his posture, something alert, like an animal caught between escape and decision. Mr. Calder. For a brief moment no one spoke. Then Hale stepped forward. "Mr. Calder," he said, "I think you had better come with us." Calder smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "I was just leaving," he said. "I don't think so." Calder's eyes flickered. To the house, to the lane, to the narrow space between. He was calculating. Miss Marple saw it. And she saw too the moment when calculation gave way to realization. There was no easy exit. "You've been looking for me," Calder said lightly. "Yes." "How flattering," Hale did not respond. "We have reason to believe," he said, "that you were in this house on the morning Miss Firth died." Calder's expression did not change. "And if I were," he said, "then you would have some explaining to do." Calder glanced toward Miss Marple. "And this is—" "Miss Marple?" said Hale. Calder inclined his head slightly. "Ah," he said, "I have heard of you." Miss Marple smiled. "I'm sure you have," she said. There was a pause. Then Calder sighed. "Well," he said, "I suppose this was inevitable." Hale stepped closer. "You admit you were here?" "Yes." "And that you killed Miss Firth?" Calder's smile returned. "Now that," he said, "is a much more complicated question." Miss Marple spoke softly. "Is it?" she said. Calder looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Because you see, Miss Marple, Miss Firth was not as innocent as everyone believes." Miss Marple's expression did not change. "No," she said. "No, she had something. Something that did not belong to her. Something valuable." "The document," said Hale. Calder's eyes flickered. "Call it what you like," he said. "She was not meant to have it." "And you came to retrieve it," Miss Marple said. "Yes." "And she refused to give it to you." Calder's smile thinned. "She was stubborn," he said. "Very stubborn." "So you persuaded her," said Miss Marple. "I tried." "And when that failed," Calder's gaze hardened, "I took what I needed." "And killed her." There was a silence. Then Calder shrugged. "She was not supposed to die," he said. "Only to sleep. But these things," he spread his hands slightly, "they do not always go as planned." Miss Marple watched him. "And the document?" she asked. Calder hesitated. "Gone," he said. Miss Marple's eyes did not leave his face. "No," she said softly. "I do not think so." Calder's expression flickered. "You returned for it," she continued, "which means you did not find it the first time." Hale looked at him sharply. Calder said nothing. Miss Marple took a step forward. "You searched the house," she said. "Afterwards, before you left. But you did not know it well enough. You did not know where she would hide something important." Calder's jaw tightened. "And so you left," Miss Marple went on, "intending to return when it was safe." "Yes," he said at last, "and now you have." Calder looked at her. "You're very clever," he said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No," she said, "only attentive." There was a pause. Then Hale said, "We will need that document, Mr. Calder." Calder laughed softly. "If I knew where it was, do you think I would be standing here?" Miss Marple's gaze moved, not to Calder, but to the house. "Yes," she said quietly, "I think you might." Hale frowned. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. She stepped past them, toward the back door. The house stood open, silent, waiting. "The answer," she said, "has been here all along." She paused at the threshold. "The same place," she added softly, "where Miss Firth placed it, because she knew he would come." Hale looked at her. "Where?" Miss Marple turned, and for the first time there was something almost like satisfaction in her eyes. The place no one thought to look, she said. She stepped inside. Because the truth, like everything else in Elm Street, had been hidden in plain sight, the house felt different now, not because anything had changed, but because everything had. Miss Marple stepped into the kitchen, followed closely by Inspector Hale. Calder remained at the door, watched firmly by the constable. Mr. Briggs stood further back, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the floor. The room was quiet, utterly, deceptively quiet. Miss Marple moved slowly to the table. The mistake, she said gently, was assuming that Miss Firth had no time to act. Hale watched her. She was interrupted, he said. The letter. Yes, Miss Marple nodded. She was interrupted, but not immediately overcome. There was a moment, a very small moment, when she understood what was happening. Calder said nothing. And Miss Firth, Miss Marple continued, was not a foolish woman. She had been cautious since October. She had already begun to fear Mr. Calder. That is why she wrote the letter. To Agnes, Hale said. Yes. Miss Marple turned slightly, her eyes moving over the kitchen once more. She knew, she said softly, that if he came again, he would not leave without what he wanted. Calder shifted slightly. And so, Miss Marple went on, she made a decision. She stepped toward the cupboard. Hale frowned. The cups, he said. Yes, said Miss Marple. She opened the cupboard and took out the blue-patterned teacup, the one with the fine crack along its rim. Habit, she said quietly. A very strong thing. Miss Firth used this cup every morning, without fail. Hale nodded. We've established that. But on that morning, Miss Marple continued, placing the cup carefully on the table, she did not use it. No, she used the white one instead. Yes, Miss Marple looked at him. And that, she said, was not a mistake. There was a silence. Calder's eyes narrowed. Miss Marple turned the blue cup in her hands. When people are frightened, she said, they often fall back on habit. But sometimes, very rarely, they do the opposite. They break habit deliberately. To signal something? Hale asked. Miss Marple smiled faintly. To protect something. She reached into the cupboard again, and this time, she did not take a cup. She took the small cloth folded beside it, wrapped inside. Something flat, something carefully hidden. She unwrapped it slowly. A document. Hale stepped forward. Good God, he said. Calder's face had gone completely still. Miss Marple held the paper lightly. Miss Firth knew, she said softly, that Mr. Calder would search, that he would look through her drawers, her desk, her obvious hiding places. But he would not look at what he believed he already understood. The cups, Hale said. Yes. She hid it in the cupboard. In the one place he would not think to check, Miss Marple said, because he believed it irrelevant. Calder let out a breath. You think this proves anything? He said. Miss Marple looked at him. I think, she said gently, that it proves you came here for it, that you attempted to take it, that you remained in the house long enough to give her something in her tea, and that when she resisted, you killed her. Calder said nothing. And I think, Miss Marple added, that Mr. Briggs has already told us the rest. Hale turned to Calder. You'll come with us, he said. This time, there was no resistance. Calder lowered his head slightly. Yes, he said. It was over very quickly after that. Statements were taken. Evidence was collected. The document, whatever its contents, was secured by the authorities. Mr. Calder was taken into custody without further incident. Mr. Briggs, pale and shaken, was led away separately. Elm Street returned slowly to its usual shape, but not entirely. A few days later, Miss Marple sat once more by Miss Harmon's window. The sky was clear. The leaves had begun to fall in earnest now, gathering in small golden drifts along the pavement. Miss Harmon poured tea. My dear Jane, she said, I cannot imagine how you saw it all so clearly. Miss Marple smiled. I didn't see it clearly at first, she said, only differently. Miss Harmon shook her head. The cups, she said. Such a small thing. Yes, said Miss Marple, but people are made of small things. There was a pause. And Mrs. Whitcomb? Miss Harmon asked. She must have known more than she said. Yes, said Miss Marple, she saw enough, but she chose not to interfere. How dreadful. Miss Marple looked out of the window. Yes, she said softly, because sometimes watching is a kind of participation. Miss Harmon shivered. And Mr. Briggs? He watched too, Miss Marple said, but for a different reason. Why? Miss Marple's eyes were thoughtful. Because he liked to know things, she said. To see without being seen. It gave him a sense of control. And yet... Yes, said Miss Marple gently. In the end, it made him part of something he didn't understand. Miss Harmon was silent for a moment. And Miss Firth? She asked quietly. Miss Marple's gaze softened. She understood, she said. At the very end. Enough to protect what mattered. The document? Yes. Miss Harmon sighed. How strange it all is, she said. Such a quiet street. Such ordinary people. Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. My dear Lydia, she said, there is nothing more dangerous than ordinary people with secrets. Outside, Elm Street lay in the pale autumn light. The hedges were still trimmed, the windows still shone, the doors still closed at the proper hour. But something had changed. Something unseen. Something that could not be restored by order alone. Miss Marple picked up her knitting. The thing about villages, she said softly, is that they remember. Miss Harmon looked at her. Do you think Elm Street will forget? Miss Marple's needles moved gently. No, she said, I do not think it will. Think,